Greetings, audiophiles and Mass Effect fans. Welcome to my reading of my fanfiction, After the Fall. This is a Mass Effect fanfiction, and as such, most of the characters and the universe belong to BioWare/EA Games. No copyright infringement is intended. However, the scenario and occurrences within this fanfiction are my intellectual property, so if you decide you want to share this with someone, credit me. Please. Part 5. Strength. Let me know if I make it too tight. Joker gently pulled the straps of the leg braces into place around Shepard's calves. I think that's good, she said, feeling the unwelcome metal, cold even through the underarmor she wore between the braces and her flesh. She had insisted that Joker be the one to help her into her new leg wear. He had worn similar ones much of his life until Cerberus had come along. As much as she hated the elusive man, she was grateful for what he had done for Joker. There we go. Joker handed her the twin canes which she would also need. Shepard's bone grafts had gone well, but she lost muscle and a lot of mobility. Pain medication was a godsend, she thought as she took the canes, nesting her elbows into the cups and tightening her hands around the grips. Easy now, Joker urged her, putting a hand against the small of her back to help her stand. She smiled crookedly. Who would have guessed it would come to this? Joker helping her walk. The strangest thing was, it wasn't unpleasant. Feeling his supportive hand and hearing his encouraging voice, Shepard achieved her feet. For a moment she thought she was going to fall back onto her bed. Not so upright, Joker instructed. Lean forward, trust the canes. She followed his directions, carefully putting more of her weight into her arms. It was strange leaning forward so much. All her life she had been fiercely upright. She could take a punch to the gut and still rise up and stand tall. Would her people even recognize her, bent over, scarred up, short hair? She certainly didn't feel like the hero she knew they were waiting to see. She bit her bottom lip, holding it in her teeth as she moved forward. Joker continued to instruct, teaching her how to alternate feet and hands to take steps. Can I come in yet? Garrus called. Shepard had made him leave the room. Strangely, the only one she wanted to help her in her struggle was Joker. Now that she was on her feet, she called to her mate. Yes. The Turian, still limping himself, came around the doorway and greeted her with a glorious smile. Are you ready? She paused to admire Garrus. He was wearing a very flattering Turian uniform. No bulky armor to obscure his shape. She wondered that Turian armor was so massive when their civilian clothing tended more towards the tight fit. She certainly didn't argue as she looked him up and down. Blue and silver? Had he commissioned that uniform especially? She looked on at her own attire, dress blues pressed and squared, not a crease out of place. Her N7 patch was still worn proudly on her arm, and her chest was adorned with more than a few medals. It felt a bit unnatural, but she knew she had to look her best. She wished she still had her hair. She knew she'd look even better with a neat military bun in place. Even Joker was dressed up, though he would only be in the audience. She smiled at her companions, and they made their way out of the hospital room. Shepard rejoiced. She had been growing too tired of that place. Her smile faded as soon as she was out the door. Where her room had been practically lavish, for a field hospital, the rest of the building was not. She could tell that this building had once been a medical facility, but it must have been sucker-punched by the war, because it was in shambles. They were on the ground floor, and Shepard suspected the upper floors were no longer viable. Likely, many no longer in existence. Plastic was put up to hastily patch gaping holes in the walls. Stretchers were strewn about. It was obvious the workers had done their best to make things sterile, but everything still had the feel of dust that had not settled. Shepard peeked into a few rooms as they went. Hers had been the most intact. I didn't know it was this bad, she said. She felt annoyed. Why had she been given the best room? Some of the people she was seeing now were certainly just as in bad a shape as she had been. Some of them were children. She shuddered. By the look of the hospital, things were worse than she had been led to believe. Nurses rushed by, wheeling a stretcher. This one was just pulled from the rubble today, dangerously dehydrated, may lose the leg. Shepard did her best to move out of the way as the staff wheeled a stretcher past. The human on it could not have been over 18. His eyes were glassy but open. When he saw her, they seemed to focus for a moment. "Wait," Shepard called. "We have no time. He needs immediate surgery," said a Solarian doctor, holding up a data pad to the light streaming in through a hole in the ceiling. Shepard made her awkward way to the patient. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, his cracked lips moved fractionally. She shook her head. She let go of one of her canes and took the boy's hand. "It's all right," she said, firmly, in the tone she would use in the field for a wounded soldier. His eyes shone slightly. He knew her. Just by being Commander Shepard, she'd given this kid a boost that drugs couldn't have. She let her hand slip out of his, and he was wheeled away. For a moment she stood, balancing on her leg braces, clasping one hand in the other. He'd trusted her. He'd loved her. Did she deserve that kind of adoration? A shudder rocked her body, and she felt Garrus wrap a hand gently around her upper arm. He silently ushered her onward. Outside the hospital, the streets were being cleared. Mechs moved rubble in the still dawn. Birds were singing somewhere, and Shepard felt her heart lift. Not so hopeless in the sunshine. Not so hopeless with the birds singing. She felt her smile return. A shuttle was waiting. Shepard and her friends climbed carefully on board. Garrus had offered to carry Shepard, but she insisted on doing it herself. Inside the shuttle, the rest of her crew waited, and she noticed at once that Steve was piloting. She would have rushed forward and hugged him if she were able. She smiled when she even saw Javik sitting near the front of the shuttle. He caught her eye and gave her a nod of respect. She returned his nod, but felt a little concern. He looked slumped, maybe a bit listless. She remembered the plans he had told her of if he survived the Reaper attack. Was he still contemplating his own death? She didn't have time to think about it, as the shuttle soon filled with chatter. Shepard was beaming. Her crew didn't talk of somber things. They didn't discuss the damage or the people still unaccounted for in the rubble. There had been and would be time for such talks. For the moment they spoke animatedly and excitedly about anything that came to mind. Joker cracked wise, Liara theorized about how quickly the Earth trees would regrow, Tally blissfully compared Earth to her homeworld, Garrus and Shepard told everyone of their plans to get married. The shuttle ride ended all too quickly. Steve deposited them behind a large, impromptu stage that had been erected for her address that day. Crowds sat in front of the stage. Shepard felt intimidated seeing all those faces. But she also felt pleased to notice that Solarian sat with Krogan, human with Turian. No one segregated themselves. These people had faced war together. It was hard to go back to distrusting your battle buddy after that. The only ones who stood to the side were the Rachni, but Shepard understood. They had no need for chairs, but squatted on their insect-like haunches watching her. The Queen was not with them, but Shepard knew she would hear what they heard, relayed back through their minds. As strange as they looked, she was glad they had come. Those of Shepard's crew that were not members of the new council went to sit in designated spots near the front. They received hearty slaps on the back and applause. When the crowd spotted Shepard, a roar went up. People sprang to their feet, giving a standing ovation. Shepard felt her cheeks go hot. Did she really deserve all this adoration? She knew she was a natural leader. She'd been second in command of the Reds at the tender age of 13. But were all these applause really in order? She had killed the Geth, after all, trapped them there in the Sol system. She swayed back a bit, as though the noise of the crowd was physically pushing her. Camera drones buzzed excitedly towards her head. Her address was being broadcast to the entire planet and the Victory Fleet. Her heart began beating a little too fast. Could she do this? Slowly she began to move toward the microphones that had been set up. There was one for each member of the new council, but she knew that she was the one everyone had come to hear speak. As she limped up, painfully aware of how weak she must look, how defeated, she wished she could show them a stronger face. She watched as the crowd sat down again, and she could feel their eagerness. She swallowed dryly. She thought about what to say, of course. She'd had a few options planned out. None of them seemed right as she stared at all the upturned faces, felt the anticipation. She began to sweat. She wished she could shoot the camera droid that had moved in for a close-up of her face. Too long. She'd been standing there too long. People were starting to look at one another. What was wrong? Had Commander Shepard's mind been damaged in the fight? Was their hero gone after all? "Commander Shepard!" a voice shouted from somewhere in the crowd. She looked up, her eyes scanning for the speaker. The camera drone spun around to search as well. Moments later, an Alliance soldier, still wearing grit-covered armor and clasping his rifle, rushed the stage. He was intercepted by Rex, and looked shakily up at the Krogan as though considering wetting his pants. The man turned uneasily towards Shepard. "Report, soldier," Shepard responded. He snapped to attention with a relieved look on his face. "Ma'am, I was ordered to get you. We found someone in the rubble. He says he's Cerberus. He's a biotic and he's erected a field around himself. He says he won't come out until we bring you, ma'am." Shepard's eyebrows shot skyward. Cerberus? "We have collected a handful of Cerberus operatives," Liara said, "mostly because they have stepped forward and turned themselves in." "Let's go," Shepard said, grabbing her canes. "Ma'am, it may be dangerous," warned the soldier. Before Garrus or Kaidan, who were nearest to her, could move to assure her that they would keep her covered, Shepard reached out a hand towards the soldier. "I'll need a weapon then." "Ma'am?" Everyone stood for a moment in confusion. Could she do that? Could she even hold a gun? "Your rifle." She tilted her head and read the rank on his arm. "Lieutenant." "Yes, ma'am." The soldier turned his weapon and handed her the butt, still wearing that same terrified expression, like a kid meeting a superhero he'd only read about in comics. Shepard took the proffered rifle, swung it expertly into the crook of her arm, cracked the heat clip, checked the sights, and smiled. "This is a well-treated weapon, LT. Now, where is this Cerberus operative?" The crowd exploded with wild cheering. At first, Shepard was startled and looked around, confused. Then she glanced down at herself. She had dropped her canes, one to each side, unnoticed. She was standing tall, soldierly. The weapon she'd just been given nested familiarly in her hands. She looked like herself, and that was all they needed. No big speeches, no fanfare and to-do. They wanted to see that she was still their leader, and they could go on through their struggles. Walking was painful. It felt as though her bones were replaced with swords, sawing away at her muscle with each step. She was setting her physical therapy back by weeks. No one tried to stop her. No one picked up her canes or offered her their arm. Instead, her crew fell in behind her as she followed the young soldier, and the crowd kept roaring.